This is so much fun to be on the call like this. It's so different to do a webinar than to have a normal call like I'm used to every day when I teach at work. A couple of people asking about the recording. We are recording it. I'm not exactly sure how it's gonna go up yet. Rajoshi, do you know how we'll put up the recording?
Yes, I think we'll be putting it up on YouTube, and we'll post the links. We'll send out a link to all the participants who've registered.
Amazing. So that's the answer to everybody asking about the recordings. You can also use the Q&A feature too. So many different things on here, and I can answer your questions through there as well as the chat. That's easier. Amazing. So it is 8:01. These types of things, people always show up a couple minutes late. So I won't get started with the material yet, but I'll start talking a little bit about what we're going to be talking about tonight, and also introduce yourself to me a little bit. And also I want to learn more about you. So I put together a little bit of a poll to learn about your backgrounds with the technologies that we're going to learn tonight, just so that I can know what to move slow through and what to move fast through. Like if you all are React pros, then I don't want to explain React from zero to you, but if you've never heard of React, I definitely want to make sure that I can help you through that. So I just put a poll in the chat, and if you can go ahead and fill that out, there are some questions. That would be really awesome so that I can gauge where you're at with what we're going to be using tonight. Yes, great question from Sarah. 5 is most comfortable. 1 is, I have no idea what this thing is. I've never heard of it. 5 is, I'm a professional and use this all day, every day. Oh no, I must have copied and pasted the question. So sorry, if there are 2 questions for Postgres, you can just answer 1. Okay, very cool. So it's looking so far like people are pretty comfortable with React and Postgres to some extent, and then a little bit less comfortable with WebSocket. So we'll spend more time explaining what those are tonight, and React as well. Also, if you want to go ahead and put a quick introduction to yourself on the chat, that would be awesome too. There are a couple tools that we'll be using tonight. I'll be screen sharing so that we will be writing like live code, and you can code along with me if you want. And then we're also going to be using the Zoom features. So there's the chat feature in here, so you can talk to different people, talk to all the panelists and attendees through there as well. And then there's also a Q&A section as well, where there are open, answered, and unanswered questions. And so you can like upvote questions in there too. It's a pretty cool piece of technology, and so I would love to use that as well. I'm really excited to see a lot of my current and former students in here too. This is really fun to have a little bit of a reunion tonight. So again, this is the link to the poll. I'm putting it in the Zoom chat again. And if you're missing the Zoom chat, along the bottom bar, there is a little chat bubble. And if there are new chat messages, then you should be able to see them there. Cool. So I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to myself as we're still waiting for some more people to show up. So a little bit about me. I am a software engineer by trade, but right now I teach people how to code as my job. So I teach a full-time bootcamp program. Right now I teach remote, but I'm actually moving over in 2 weeks to be the faculty lead for the on-campus program. So I will be teaching teachers and also teaching students how to code. So really, really excited about that. So one of my former students just asked how many former students are in here. He is one. Unfortunately, I don't think everybody can see this, but there are a decent amount in the audience tonight, maybe 10 or so students that I am either currently working with or formerly have worked with. So I'm pretty excited to see you all here. So I also wanted to tell you a little bit about my background with GraphQL as well. So back in the day, I started using GraphQL in 2015, which is the year that GraphQL actually came out. And I was working at a startup, and I like to talk about the idea of shiny object syndrome, which is when you see this hot new technology come out and you immediately want to convert everything to it. And this startup very much had shiny object syndrome, which was great for me as a relatively new developer because I got to get my hands on a lot of different technologies, but also in some ways, maybe we're adopting things really fast. And GraphQL was one of those things to me that we were using it so early on, I just didn't understand why we were using it. And I thought it was making my job a lot more difficult. And at that point, it probably was. There wasn't a lot of documentation yet, but I've been using Hasura a lot recently, and Hasura has really brought me around to seeing the awesome parts of GraphQL, and I'm really, really excited to share it with you all tonight. It's probably the fastest I've ever been able to build a backend period for a website, and so I am incredibly excited to share this all with you all tonight. We're going to be building a game, so that's a little bit different probably than a lot of the applications you all work on at work, and hopefully it'll show you the features that you can work with within Hasura and also GraphQL. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to start working through this tutorial I have built on that we're going to be working through tonight. We're also going to do different activities and things like that. So technologies that you should have installed, if you have Node and Npm, that would be excellent so that you can run React code on your computer. Also, having a text editor of some sort, so VS Code or Sublime Text or anything like that, those are really the only things that you should need. Maybe having Git would be good as well, but nothing too fancy. And the Hasura side, you don't need to have anything installed. It's just for the front end that we're going to be building later on. So again, we're going to be using Postgres for our database. We're going to be using GraphQL on top of that. And then we're going to be using React for our front end. And we're going to make that the connection use WebSocket so that our data is live updating and real time. So really, really exciting. The objectives for tonight are to explain what GraphQL and Hasura are, how they work together. We're also going to set up a Hasura server and get that up and running using Postgres as our database level, and we're going to be playing with queries on there. We're also going to create some GraphQL queries and mutations, and then we're also going to connect all of this to a front end that's built out in React. I first want to talk about what GraphQL and Hasura are because they're the technologies we're going to be working on a lot tonight. So essentially, GraphQL is a query language for APIs. And what that means is normally when you're building a REST API, so an API with different actions that you can take and different endpoints that you can go to and get different information or send different data to and update the data that you have stored in your database. Normally, in a REST API, you will have a bunch of those different routes, and they're not super flexible. You have to have a route for everything that you could possibly need. GraphQL makes it so that you can have one endpoint, so your backend becomes really, really simple, and then you query for data on your front end. And you use this GraphQL query language that is really nice and robust and looks a lot like maybe JavaScript, more so than SQL queries. And using that GraphQL query language, we're going to be able to select exactly what data we want from our database. And we can update our data as well using something called Mutations, and we'll learn more about those tonight as well. And this becomes really, really, really helpful when you have separate front end and back end teams. And so the front end team might need some sort of data. And so instead of the back end team having to make an endpoint for every single type of data that they could possibly need, the front end team will be able to query for that data themselves. And so it makes it so that the data that you're able to fetch is a lot more flexible. You can get exactly what you want back instead of getting everything every time or not enough data. There's a really, really awesome analogy in the article by Sasha Grief, who also does the State of JavaScript survey, so definitely somebody to follow. So he wrote this article, so what is this GraphQL thing I keep hearing about? And in there he has an analogy about how the old REST model is like ordering pizza, then getting groceries delivered, then calling your dry cleaner to get your clothes, 3 shops, 3 different phone calls. And then GraphQL is like having a personal assistant. Once you've given them the addresses to all 3 places, they'll just do all of those tasks for you. So you can do everything all at once rather than having to do every single thing separately. So GraphQL kind of centralizes everything and makes a lot of these tasks a lot simpler. GraphQL is also language agnostic, so you can, it kind of lives in between the client and the server layer. So you can write your backend in any language that you want. I've personally used it mostly with Django backend, so building a GraphQL layer on top of Django, but you can do it with Express, or you can do it without writing your own backend code like we're gonna do tonight with Hasura. It's gonna be super fun. So this Hasura thing I keep talking about and that you signed up through tonight is going to allow you to build a GraphQL backend at lightning speed. We're pretty much going to be able to click some buttons and have a full-fledged backend written for our application we're building, which is really, really cool and something that I haven't seen before, and my mind was totally blown. So I have a podcast called the Ladybug Podcast along with 2 of my other very close friends, and we did an episode on GraphQL. And Rajoshi, who's on the call for Hasura, was one of our guests, and she explained what Hasura was on that call. So I played around with it a little bit, and my mind was absolutely blown. Like, you can literally click a button, as we see in a second, and then we're going to be able to create data and a database and all that all at once. So we're going to use some of the features of Hasura tonight. We're going to build an instant real-time GraphQL API on top of a new database. We're also going to use the dashboard that Hasura creates for us. And then we can react to those changes in your database with webhooks, external APIs, serverless functions on demand. They may show you a little bit more of that later tonight. And another thing that you can do is if you have a bunch of different data sources on your application, you can use Hasura to centralize them all, stitch them all together, and have a centralized GraphQL API. So a lot of really, really awesome features in Hasura. So we're going to go ahead and start building out this application we're going to be working on. I'm going to go back to Zoom really quickly because I can't see the chat feature while I'm screen sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, send out this link for Hasura real quick, and then I'll start sharing again. So I just sent out this link. You should be able to see it in that little chat that we've been talking about. And if you click on it, it'll take you to this page on Heroku. Heroku is a really, really great service for deploying applications in general. It's really quick and requires a lot less manual configuration than spinning up your own server or something like that. And so once we're at this Heroku page, you're going to see this instructions for creating a Hasura GraphQL engine. This button also lives on the hasura.io homepage. So if you ever want to come back to this, you can go to the Hasura.io homepage, click the button on there, and create an app this way as well. You're going to create an app name. We're going to be building like a pixel art drawing app. I'll show you it in a little bit. So make an application name that kind of fits that. Mine's going to be called PixArt Hasura, so don't steal my name. And I'm going to click that Deploy App button right there. It's going to run some scripts for me. And it was deployed. Yours might take a little bit longer than mine, so I'll give a couple more minutes before I move on. But once you're there, you can go ahead and go to View, this little purple button down there with the pop out to view your application, and you get to this Hasura console. Okay, so now that we have something up and running, or hopefully you're close to having something up and running, we're going to go ahead into the data tab here. It looks a little bit like a database. You can see the 3 dots. And we're going to create some tables. We're going to create some data and we're going to play with it. So for now, I'm going to create 2 tables, artists and songs, and we're going to have a relationship between those artists and songs so that our artists have songs that belong to them. And then we're going to play around with that data. Our live data will be based off of pixel art instead. So this won't be our final project, but I just want you all to play around with GraphQL for a little bit first. So I'm going to create a table here. So again, going to this data tab, clicking the create table button, the yellow one here, and then you can create a table name. So I'm going to call mine artists. And then we get to create columns. So I am going to first do an ID column, which will be my primary key. So when you're working with a SQL database, or pretty much any type of database, you're going to want to have one column that's a unique identifier. So some sort of unique information to that row in the database. And normally that's an ID or something called a slug. And I'm going to call mine ID, and I'm going to change it to an integer with auto increment. And what that's going to do is Postgres, which is the database service that we're using, is going to automatically add that ID column for us and automatically make it one ID higher each time. So my first item in the database will have ID 1, second one will have ID 2, etc. And there's a little drop down here that says that I can set my primary key. So I am going to select ID to be my primary key field. You can have multiple primary keys, but the ID will be mine. It will be my unique identifier in my database. And then I'm going to set up another column. This one is going to be name. So this will be my artist name. And then I get to make a column type here as well. And I'm going to do text because I want their name to be stored in text. You could also do all these different ones here. Postgres is so amazing. You can have like a money field or a char field, character field, but we'll use a text field here. And then the third column that I'm going to create is genre. So we're creating musicians, and they'll have different genres associated with them. So genre, and that will also store text information. Once I have this data all set up, I'm going to go to the bottom of the page and click the bright yellow Add Table button. And we have a database. You can go to the Browse Rows tab, and it'll show you all the rows of data that you have in your database. So right now, we don't have any data, which makes sense. We haven't made any data yet. But what if we go over to this Insert Row tab? Then we could add data to our database. So the ID one is going to be added for us by Postgres, so we don't need to worry about that. But the name and genre are two that we can add ourselves. So I'm going to add Britney Spears, who's my favorite. I have written blog posts explaining JavaScript things through Britney Spears songs, so you should definitely check that out if you haven't. And then genre, she is a pop, definitely a pop artist. Then you see this green inserted pop-up come up. Then you can go back over to the Browse Rows tab, and now you have data. You can edit it, you can delete it, you can even copy it if you want to duplicate those rows. And then I'm going to create a second table. So I'm going to create one for my songs. So I'm going to click that data tab again. Click Create Table. Add a table name. So this time it's going to be songs. Add some columns. So I'll do ID again as my primary key. So again, that's my column in the database that's unique to each individual row. My columns, I'm going to also add one for title. So the song will have a title associated with it. This will be text. And that's all I'll do just because it's a demo and we don't need to go too in depth, but you could do the length, you could do producers. The one other thing though, I'm going to add a foreign key column as well so that I can relate my artists to my songs. Foreign keys are how we store relationships in SQL databases. We can have columns that store IDs of another column or another table, and the rows in that this database or this row in the database is associated with. So say I have different artists in my database. Britney Spears right now has my ID of 1, right? And so I could say that my new song that I'm creating, that's a Britney Spears song, so Hit Me Baby One More Time, it belongs to Britney Spears. So this foreign key column is going to then store the ID of Britney Spears. So we're going to call this artist ID. And people are talking about how it's like in Django, and it's exactly like how it's in Django, which is a Python framework that is one of my favorite things to work with. And also more suggestions coming up in this chat too, in case the Heroku creation was not working for me. The restart all dynos seemed to work as well. So always fun. Okay, so this artist ID column again is going to store the ID of the artist that the song belongs to. This is going to be an integer column, and down here we're going to create a foreign key. So right here, add a foreign key. It's going to be in the public schema, and then our reference table is going to be artists. So we're relating our artist table and our songs table. And the columns that we're going to relate are artist ID to ID. And so you now have that relationship between our two different tables. So our artists will have songs associated with them. And then we can also specify what happens if we update or delete an item. And I'm going to go with Cascade. That'll make it so that if I delete the artist, it'll delete all of the songs associated with that artist. So that's what I'm going to do. You can change that up if you want. I'm going to go ahead and save that. So now I've got my two tables, artists and songs, and both of them have data associated with them. Before I keep moving, does anybody have questions about this process of creating columns and tables and all of that? Amazing. So this might blow your mind, but now we have a backend all written for us. So we didn't have to write any code, and we have a backend written for us. So again, what I had to do, oh no, I didn't click create table for songs. So my artist table looks like this. So my data, I have an ID column, a name column, and a genre column. The name and the genre are text, and my ID is an integer primary key. And then I'm going to recreate my songs table because I messed that up. ID, which is integer that auto increments. I have a genre, I have a title, and then I have a artist ID, which is an integer. And then I have my primary key, which is my ID column, my foreign key, which relates my artist and my song. And then I need to click this yellow add table button, which I didn't before. And so again, we have a backend created, which is pretty cool. I'm getting a couple of questions on there. I did quickly show the artist right there. So again, the artist will have the ID, the name, and the genre on there with those data types. And then you can add more columns in the modified tab. Yep, so you can go to that and change your data there. Is there so I got another question through the Q&A feature and asking if there's a limit to the number of tables. I think the only limit would be to Heroku's free tier. I think you're allowed to create unlimited amounts of tables, but with Heroku's free tier, they only allow you to have, I believe, 1,000 rows in your database. It might be 1,000, it might be 10,000, but I think it's 1,000 rows. And after that, you have to pay for their upgraded Postgres service. So that's the limit to it, is the Heroku free tier of Postgres, but that's pretty much it. And then another question about doing this running on Heroku where you don't have a way to generate the migrations. So not explicitly through here where you don't have migrations files, though you can run Hasura locally. And I wonder if you could have migrations files on there. I haven't tried to create migrations files, so I don't know the exact answer to that, but my guess would be to try to do the local version of Hasura. So the songs, I can show you the schema for songs again as well. The Postgres instance is hosted by Heroku right now, but Postgres interacts incredibly well with Hasura. So my song data looks like this, where I have ID, title, text, artist ID, which is an integer, but it's also a foreign key. Okay. Awesome. Well, we'll keep on moving. I'm going to create a song as well. So again, to create a new song, I'm going to go ahead to the Insert Row tab over here, and I can type in the title of the song that I want to add. And I'll do Stronger by Britney Spears. And then my artist ID will be 1 because Britney Spears has my ID of 1 right now. And press save there. And it was created. I'm going to go back to my data tab right now, and it says that my foreign key relationships are not tracked right now, so I'm just going to click that track all button right there, and that will add in my relationships, and I can navigate them in GraphQL, which is the next thing that we're going to look at. Cool. I'll give another second for people to catch up, but again, we have the artist table, the songs table. The artist table has ID, name, and genre, and then the songs has my ID, my title, and then my artist ID. And then to get the tracked stuff, it was listed right here for me. So it was, when I went to the data tab again, it said untracked foreign key relations, and I clicked the track all button. I can't replicate it though because it's there now. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna move over to the graphical section, so, or GraphQL. I never know how to pronounce some things when I say them out loud because I say them so many times in my head that I'm like, is that actually how you say that? But I'm going to move over to the graphical tab, and Graphical or GraphQL is this really, really amazing tool that allows us to build GraphQL queries. And so we're going to go ahead and play around with this and get some data back, create some data, and learn some GraphQL. So again, we talked about what GraphQL was a little bit earlier. It's a query language that allows us to fetch exactly the data that we want. So we have one endpoint for our application instead of multiple on multiple. So we can create queries, and I love this Explorer feature on Graphical because it allows me to just click on things to create queries. So I am going to go ahead and query for all of my artists. And you can see this is the syntax within GraphQL for creating a query. So you first have the word query, and then you have the name of the query. So I'll call it get artists. is a much more descriptive name than my query. And then inside of the curly braces, it has the different fields that we're querying. So at this point, we are getting artists, and then we can get the different fields that we want within artists. So right now, if we run this query, which we can, it's going to go ahead into our database and query for all of our artists and give it back in this data structure. So it's a JSON object, and it has data and artists, and it's an array of all of the artists that we have in our database with all of the data that we asked for. If we made it so it no longer asks for name and reran that query, you can see that now it just gave me the genre and the ID. If we add the name back, then it shows up again. So we get exactly the data that we're asking for within this query. We can also get all of those songs that are related to it. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on songs, and it'll populate for me. And we're gonna have a second set of curlies for all of the fields that we want from the songs. So I probably just want the ID and the title there. That's going to be the data that we get from songs. And now if I run this query, you can say I have this second array that has all of my songs and all of my IDs and titles because I asked for those. If I remove title here, then I just have my ID left, but I can get all of my data back in this way. I can also do fancy things where I get only distinct information or order them in certain ways. So if I order my artists alphabetically, I can do that. Right now it's not going to do anything because I only have one artist, but I can get exactly the data that I want back in exactly the way that I want it back without doing a ton of work, which is the really awesome feature of GraphQL. Anybody have any questions about GraphQL queries and the syntax for them? I always use this graphical explorer to test out my queries. It makes my life so much easier. I also want to talk about mutations. So queries are to fetch data, so to get certain data back. Mutations are to change data. So if we want to add data to our database or update or anything like that, then we can use mutations. And I just got a question about how to link the GraphQL to the database. And I actually didn't have to do anything. I just tabbed over to the Graphical tab and it works just like that. Pretty cool. Also getting questions about using Hasura as a headless CMS. And there are some really awesome blog posts out there about that. I know that people use it in conjunction with Gatsby to create sites there. But it would be a really, really awesome tool to use as a headless CMS, I think. Cool. So again, we're going to go back to creating mutations. So I'm going to click this Add New Mutation button, and it's going to make it so that I'm making a mutation instead of a query. Again, a query is to get data back. Mutation is to change your data. So all of those actions that you would normally do with your different request types in a REST API, where you do like your post request or your put request or your delete request in order to change your data in some way, you would do that within a mutation within GraphQL. So let's go ahead and create one to create a new artist because we don't have very many in our database right now. So I'm going to click on this insert artists thing here. I'm going to delete the type name right there. Don't need it. And then I'm going to rename my mutation to create artist. I'm going to click on the fields that I want to add. So I'm just going to do genre and name because the ID will be added to me for me automatically within Postgres, so I don't need to worry about that. So I can add a genre. I'll do rap, and I'll do a name. So I'll do Kid Cudi. And I can also just directly add a song too. So my artist ID is now going to be 2 because Kid Cudi is going to be ID number 2. My title, I'll do day, night. And then returning, this is the data that I'm going to get back once I run this query. So maybe I'll just get my genre, name, and ID back. So again, my query looks something like this. Insert artists, objects. This is the data that I want to insert into my database. So I'm going to be creating new artist with the genre rap, the name Kid Cudi, and then any songs that I want to add as well. So I have my artist ID, which is 2 because Postgres is going to add that for me. Title is going to be day and night. And then returning, this is the data that I'm going to get back when I run my query. So this is what's going to get back. And I can run this. Oh, okay. I don't need my artist ID. I'm going to delete that because my parent already decided that GraphQL was smarter than I expected. So now I can run that query again without the artist ID. And it worked for me. It did the join automatically there too. And yeah, it does the joining for us automatically, so we don't have to worry about it. GraphQL handles all of that behind the scenes, and we don't even have to think about it really. The foreign key relationships are handled for us. And now I'm gonna go back over to my query tab, add a new query to get all my artists. And then I'm going to get all my artists, order by name. I'll get the genre ID name back. My songs by title. I'll just have that. Run that query for my query. I should have named it something better. But you can see that I got my artists back and they were nested with my songs. So I have this really nice data structure that I can work with, and I can use this data as soon as I connect it to my front end. So I've got this really robust, flexible backend with unlimited endpoints essentially. So I can get any data that I want or change any data that I want with one endpoint. So I don't need to make all of these different routes on my backend. I just have this one route, and then I can use these queries to get exactly the data that I need back. Amazing. Okay, any questions? You want to put the questions in the Q&A if you have any? That would be awesome. I also love the people helping out in the chat. That is so helpful. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you all maybe 2 or 3 minutes to play around with these queries and create some and work on some data right here. And just play around with it for a few minutes. I don't know how to use the raise hand feature. I'm super sorry. If instead you could put your question in either the Q&A or the Zoom chat, that will be something that I can use, but I don't know what I can do with the raise hand feature, to be honest. And to connect the 2 tables via foreign key, you can go to the data tab, and then go to your table that you want to add the foreign key on, which is songs, and go to modify. And once you're on the modify, then you can add different columns and add foreign keys and all of that right on there. So does that answer your question, Sarah? Shamira, can we use this with like Netlify or only Heroku? So this does have a backend and it does connect to a database, so you can't use a static hosting service like Netlify for this, but you can use other backend services as well. Heroku's just really nice and has this deploy button, so you can have Heroku spun up and show everything just like this. So Heroku's awesome. Another good question, how does adding a song work with attaching an artist? So when we create this new artist, GraphQL knows, because we're creating this song nested to the artist. So this artist we're creating has the song nested within it. It knows that this artist is the parent, and it's going to create that relationship right there. Amazing. So again, I'll give you a couple minutes to go ahead and play around with GraphQL for a little bit. If you find anything cool, go ahead and drop it in the chat. I'm sure the other attendees would love to learn, and maybe I would too. Oh, I can allow people to talk. So if somebody wants to talk, they can put it in the chat that they want to talk, I guess. Okay, anybody find anything cool on GraphQL? You can raise your hand and I can unmute you, I think. Eduardo, I think I unmuted you. Maybe not. You might have to unmute yourself. Oh, sorry. I don't know if it's working. Zoom is hard. This is the first time I'm using the webinar type technology instead of just normal calls, so it's a little bit different. But Eduardo, if you want to unmute yourself, I made it so that you can talk, I believe. Okay. So again, we have this backend set up, which is really cool. And this is really all that we have to do. We can play around with these queries. We have our data created. You can play around with it and see what's going on, but this is really all that we need. I'm going to go ahead and go to our actual application that we're going to be building tonight. So this was a good way to play with data, but we're going to also build a game. So I guess that's playing with data too. And I'll Slack out the repository again. Here's my repository. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create this pixel art application. So I'll show you what that looks like. So it's this little drawing app, and we can draw on it and then refresh the page, and that drawing still persists because we're storing the data in the database. And then I can also live see what other people are drawing, and we can kind of collaborate together. So if I do this pink and just make everything pink, you can see that in both tabs, my drawing is updating. So very exciting. You can draw with your friends. Once you build this in this tutorial tonight, you can go ahead and share this with all your friends and draw together collaboratively. So pretty exciting. And somebody is drawing as we speak. So this is my Netlify deployed app if you all want to play with it. But we're going to go ahead and recreate this using Hasura, and also the front end will be written in React. So we'll go ahead and create up a database for this. And you can see how it's updating with all y'all's drawings, and I'm not even refreshing anything. So pretty snazzy. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and create my table for this. It's going to be a really, really simple database table. All that I need to do is create a ID column and then also a color column. So I am again going over to my data tab where I can create tables. I'm going to create a new table. I'm going to call it pixels. And then I'm going to create some columns. So I'll do ID. The column type will be, again, this auto-incrementing integer so that we have a unique identifier for each row, which is our primary key. So I set it to the primary key right there. And then I'm also going to do the color. So this is going to store which color each individual pixel is. And this one's going to be a text field. And that's all I need. So again, ID, which is an integer, auto increment, and color, which is a text field. Once I'm done, just need to make sure that I click the add table button, which will create that for me. You can also delete your sample data if you want, so you can delete the artists, the songs, if you want, but if you want to keep playing with your data, you can. Up to you. We're not going to use it again. I just wanted to demo creating data. And then we're going to add some seed data. So if you're using Hasura locally, you can go ahead and write a seed script on there. I made a populate.sql file here, and I'm going to share it out to you. And we're just going to copy and paste this. So you go ahead and copy that. It's 400 lines of white, so all of our pixels are going to be white by default, and then we're going to overwrite that as we go. So you can just copy and paste this SQL code. I slacked it out as well. I know it's a little bit annoying, but this was the best way I could think of for this tutorial. Again, locally you can create actual seed scripts for Hasura. We're just doing it on Heroku, so we don't have that. And on data, we're going to go to this SQL thing. So if you see the SQL button down there at the bottom, go ahead and click on that, and it's going to allow us to write raw SQL code. So instead of using the user interface for Hasura for creating columns and creating data and all of that, we can write raw SQL data queries as well. So for me, I like doing things through code a lot of the time, so this is a really awesome feature for me. And again, I just pasted all of that data from this populate.sql script that I slacked out, or didn't slack out, that I put in the Zoom chat. I am now over here in this raw SQL tab, which I got to through clicking the SQL button down there. And then I'm going to go ahead and run that query. I forgot a semicolon at the end. I am messing things up. So make sure that you change that last comma to a semicolon. I wrote a JavaScript script to write my SQL for me, and I had a bug in my JavaScript code, so sorry about that. Is it working? I don't think it's working. It's the demo fairies again. Oh, yep, it did enter them. So now I have 520 rows in my database because I was clicking so many times. So I'm gonna have to clear out my database and then run it again. So that's embarrassing. If you did what I did, I'll send out the query for clearing a table in Postgres. So what we're gonna do is just run the SQL query. We're gonna run that. So what I'm going to do is go back to this SQL here, clear that, truncate pixels, delete from pixels, select that again. You should have 400 rows. So there should be 400 items in your database instead of a bajillion. It's going to be a square. So ran that command. Then I went back. I'm going to run my populate script again. Only going to click run once this time. Make sure that I have a semicolon at the bottom. And now I just have 40 pages, which means I have 400 items in my database this time. So always fun. It's amazing because I practiced these tutorials so many times and always things still go wrong. Too funny, but we fixed it. You all get to see live debugging, so that's a good thing to show as well. Any questions about this process? About what we're doing, why we're doing it? Essentially, we're just making it so that all of our pixels are white by default, and then once we start drawing, then it's going to draw on top of it. Yeah, I clicked that button a lot of times. I created a lot of data, so now we're up to IDs 5,000. Oh yeah, in order to see that it worked, I just went into this pixels table right here, and it shows all of my data when I go to that pixels table. And again, there should be 400 items in the database or 40 pages. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and transition over to working on the front end. So we have a React front end that we're gonna be working on. We're going to be working through that. I'm gonna Slack out my code. So this is the GitHub repository. We're gonna go ahead and clone this down if you have Git on your computer. Otherwise, you can just do this like download button instead, this download zip, that will work as well. But we are going to create the React code. So what I have for you is some starter code. So a lot of the React logic is built out for you, whereas, and we're gonna fill in the GraphQL code so that we don't have to spend all night writing React, because I know you all came for GraphQL instead, and people's comfort level on that poll that I sent out with React was pretty high, all things considered. So I'm going to go ahead, and I have this like code tab on my computer that I normally put my code things in. And I'm going to clone down this repository. I wrote it on my computer, so I can't clone it down, but I'm going to go ahead and CD into that Hasura tutorial live repository that I just cloned down. Yours will probably just be Hasura tutorial. Also, a little bit of a cheat code here is that there are 3 different branches that I made. So if you ever get behind in the code, first, all the code is in this lesson plan, so you can go through the code here, but you can also cheat a little bit and go to these different branches if you want any stage of the solution. So no WebSockets will give you the static version of the site where it adds data to the database but doesn't have that live connection, and then the solution code will have the final version where it live updates and all that. So you can go ahead and check those out if you want to skip ahead or anything like that. So I just cloned it down again. Hopefully you all were able to do so as well. And then I am going to go ahead and run npm install, which is going to install all of the packages that are in our package JSON. So all the dependencies that we need for this project are going to install. Let me talk a little bit about those. We're going to be using a series of libraries under the Apollo umbrella. So Apollo has a bunch of libraries for working with GraphQL, both on the front end and back ends of projects, but we're going to use the one specific to React tonight. They are really awesome tools for working with GraphQL. Show off what we're using. So We're using Apollo's React Hooks extension. We're using React Hooks tonight, so hopefully everybody's prepared for that. If not, that's fine. I can talk through hooks. We're going to use Apollo Boost, which has some things that we'll use in it. GraphQL library, Apollo Link WebSockets, or WS, that stands for WebSockets. This is going to allow us to have that real-time live connection where all of our data is populating. And then subscriptions, transport, WS is going to allow us to do WebSockets as well. So that's what we're installing here. Just easier to do it all at once than all independently, but just wanted to talk through that Apollo is what we're going to be using for connecting to GraphQL on our front end. Any questions about that? I'm not seeing any Q&A right now, but would love to answer anything that you all have for me. Go ahead and open up your text editor of choice with this code for tonight. All of the code is in this source folder. And if you do npm run start to run your React server, it should pop up. And it's a static version of the site for now. So I can click on these green things and it works, but if I refresh the page, it doesn't persist. So right now we're not connected to a database, but we do have the code to draw a little bit. So what I'm going to have you do is take about 5 minutes pouring through the code base. If you have any questions for me, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A, and I'd love to answer. Feel free to code review me as well. That's fine. I understand. Always like to grow. So again, all of my code is in this source folder. There's the app file, the color picker, and then the pixel. Those are the ones that we have code in so far. And we're going to be swapping this code that is pre-written over to actually connect to Hasura. And then once it's connected to Hasura, we're going to make it a live connection through WebSocket. So those are the steps that we're going to go through. And I'll be quiet so you can actually look through the code for a little bit. Yes, everything is written using hooks. I'm trying to get better with them. The last company that I have worked with, or the last couple companies, haven't had hooks implemented in their code base yet, so I'm trying to challenge myself to use hooks as much as possible in my own projects so that I get better with them. Thanks, Brian. My code will not pass right now because my test is very much failing. I should have deleted this app.test.js file. Would not get my pull request merged. again, I have a lot of former students or current students in the audience, and so I get to lecture them about how many tests that they should have all the time. So I think it's all fair if they critique me here. Everybody have a little bit of time to look through. If you want more time, go ahead and use that raise hand functionality, and I'll give you some more time to look through. If not, we'll start writing code. Okay, so again, all of my steps are in this README that I wrote for you all. So if you want all the steps laid out, they are here. I used git diffs to show you what's changing. I'm not gonna have this up on my screen, but if you like having something like that, please feel free to use it. It might help to have the slower code there if you fall behind or anything like that. So just wanna point that out again, that all of this code is here for you if you need it. And it is definitely fine if you do need it, because I'm trying to go with the middle, but you never know if I'm moving too fast or too slow, especially since everybody's muted. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna need to do is go ahead and connect to GraphQL. So we created this GraphQL server. We're going to need to go ahead and connect to it. So we're going to need to import some things in order to connect to it. So again, we're using all of those amazing Apollo services, and we're going to use those libraries to create that connection to Hasura, that backend that we built. So we're going to go ahead and import HTTP link from Apollo link HTTP. So this is going to allow us to connect to GraphQL server via HTTP transfer. So that's what that one will do. We're going to import Apollo client. And then we're also going to import the in-memory cache from Apollo's cache in memory. So anybody else using the new VS Code auto import feature all the time? I'm like getting unused to typing all my imports because I've been using that all the time. It's a lot of fun. And then I'm going to go ahead and make this connection exportable so I can use it in other files. I'm creating this instance of the Apollo client. I need to specify a cache for this Apollo client. So new in-memory cache, which is what we're going to use here. And then we're going to set up a link to our server. So new HTTP link, our URI. So this is the URI to your Heroku server. So I am going to go ahead and drop mine in. I'm going to use that live one that has the data populated just for demonstration purposes, but you go ahead and use the one that you created. So it will look something like this. If I go to the page, so PixArtTogether HerokuApp.com, it'll spin up this console, and it will give you a link to the endpoint. So it's v1 GraphQL, and that will have our GraphQL link that we need to connect to. So go ahead and copy that from this place on Hasura. Again, Hasura makes everything so easy. I love it. copy and paste that URI right there. And now we have a connection created to Apollo client. So that's awesome. I'll keep this up on my screen for another second, but then we're going to move on to the index.js file, and we're going to update that so our whole entire React component hierarchy has access to this Apollo client and we can query from anywhere. So we're going to go ahead and move over to that index.js file. Again, my connection.js code is in that README or in the solution branches if you need that. I got a question about whether we need to add this to anything to the list of dependencies. As long as you ran npm install already, you are good, because all the packages that we need for tonight are already in that package JSON, so you're good to go. I am going to then, again, move over to my index.js, and I am going to use the Apollo provider. So import Apollo provider from @Apollo React hooks. So Apollo has this React hooks library that allows us to use React hooks, which is awesome. We're using cutting edge technology here all around. And we're going to use the Apollo provider here. We're going to wrap our app component in that so that all of our components have access to this Apollo provider. So Apollo provider. And our app gets sandwiched in the middle. So the app used to be all alone, but now it's wrapped in the Apollo provider. This kind of looks like React Router if you've used that before. And then I'm also going to import all that connection information that I just created. So import connection from that connection file. And I need to provide that to the Apollo provider. So client equals connection. And this will now allow me to make GraphQL queries in any one of my components. And we're going to be doing that throughout tonight. I'll give you all another second to do this before I change Windows again. I feel bad because there's so many files when I'm building things and I don't want to move too fast for anybody. But again, we're just adding this Apollo provider and wrapping our app component in that and using that. Okay, so now we get to write the fun parts of the code instead of just doing configuration things. So we're going to move over to our app.js, and that's where we're going to create our query that pulls all of our pixels from our data sets on Heroku. So we're going to create GraphQL queries here in order to do that. So right now I have this hard-coded array of pixels that they're all white, but we're going to make this data dynamic. So again, that React hook library from Apollo has a hook called useQuery in it. So kind of similar to something like useState, where useState allows you to use state within your functional components. useQuery allows you to use GraphQL queries within your React components. So import useQuery from Apollo React hooks. And then we're also going to import GQL from GraphQL tag. This is a template literal tag that allows us to write GraphQL queries within template literals. So I'm importing those two things and I'm going to use them in a minute. But I want to tab back over to Hasura, and on Hasura, I'm going to go ahead and create my query that I'm going to plug in. So I'm going to copy my link here. Go back to that. And now that I'm on here, in my Graphical, I'm going to play around with my data and make it so that I have a query that gets the information that I want. So the information that I want on this page is all of my pixels. And the data that I need from my pixels is my color and my ID. So I also want to order my pixels by ID. The reason why I want to do this is so that I always get my pixels back in the right order. So if I make it so that they're not sorted by ID, they're gonna be sorted by the order in which they were updated at. So all of my most recently updated pixels are gonna get pushed to the top of my picture instead of staying where they should be. So just wanna make sure that we don't have that situation. So I'm going to go ahead and do an order by ID right there and ascending. I'll go ahead and test that query out. Yours should be all white right now. Mine right now is the multiple colors, which I'm using for demonstration purposes. And this is exactly the query that I want, that it's got all my IDs in ascending order, and it's got all of my colors as well. And you can see that this is the data structure that I'm going to get back once I run this query. So I'm going to have to access my data in this way, where I have my data attribute and then my pixels attributes, and then it's an array of this data. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that query right there. And back in my app.js, I'm going to create a constant variable that stores that query. So const get pixels. And I'm going to use that GQL template literal tag. So GQL my GraphQL query, and then a closing backtick. It is important that you use backticks here. And my whole GraphQL query is going to go inside of that. So get pixels is my query. GQL allows me to write GraphQL queries in template literals. So that's what I'm doing so far. Again, feel free to put questions throughout in this Q&A section, or just go in the Zoom chat, totally fine. And then I'm gonna use that use query hook. So we are going to go ahead and grab that. So it's going to return 3 things that we need: loading, error, and data. And use query takes the argument get pixels. So that's the query that we're passing to it. So use query takes the GraphQL query as the argument. Loading is going to be whether or not our query is still loading. So it'll turn into a false statement once we get our data back. Error is if we have any errors, it will store that in a variable. And then once we get our live data back, it's going to be stored in this data variable. I am really quickly going to make an if statement here that just shows a loading thing if we're still loading. So if loading is true, then we're just going to return div loading or something like that, so that if I don't have my data back yet, it just renders loading on my page instead of giving me an error. Once I have that data back, instead of just looping through those hard-coded pixels that I had before, I am going to iterate through my data.pixels, because my data structure stored in that data variable right there, it has the attribute pixels. And so I can do the same thing here, just gonna be a little bit different. That being said, I also have to change this data. So pixel will be my individual pixel. So I do need to do pixel.color. And I probably want to change this to pixel.id, and I also do need to pass the ID in as well. So ID equals pixel.id. So now I'm making it so that that pixel component takes in my live data instead of the hard-coded data that I had before. Moment of truth when I load my app, and you can see that I had my data all show up correctly, which is exciting. If you want to make sure that yours is working correctly too, you can go into your data tab on Hasura, go into your pixels table, and change the color of a couple of your pixels. So just make them white or yellow or whatever. It doesn't matter. Just change that color there. On Hasura, you use this little edit button right here in order to change that color. And then once you do that, refresh this page, and then you hopefully should see your live pixel data instead of it being hard-coded all white anymore. So that's all we needed to do in order to connect that part to Hasura. Again, we connected to GraphQL at first. And then once we were connected, we did that in our index.js. We wrote a GraphQL query to get all of our pixels back. And then we used the use query hook to get our data back using that query. And then we made it so that our data was our live data instead of anything else, instead of that hard-coded white array. Amazing. So the only thing is that still, if I draw on my app, it works locally, but if I refresh, it doesn't persist. So I need to write a mutation that makes it so that every single time that I update or click on one of these squares, I send a request to GraphQL that I want to change the color of the pixel in the database. So I'm going to use a GraphQL mutation for that. I'm going to go ahead and go into my pixel component and add the mutation there. So I need to import that GQL template tag as again. So so many files open. So again, this GQL GraphQL tag right here. And I'm also going to import the use mutation hook. They're well named, so if I want to write a mutation, I do the use mutation. If I want to do a query, then it's use query. Hollow React hooks right there. And then I need to make a mutation to change my color. And one of the really awesome things about GraphQL is it allows us to use variables as well. So instead of updating my pixel every single time to be the same color, I can put a variable in instead. And so I'm going to go back to Hasura, and I'm going to play around in Graphical to make my mutation. So I'm going to go to the add new mutation thingy right here and use the Explorer to write this. So update pixels where ID equals, and that's going to be a variable. So I can go ahead in my mutation declaration line, I can go ahead and create some variables. So what I'm going to do is make it so that it takes in ID. So the $sign is for variables. And then I need my data type for my variable. So it's going to be an integer. And then I'm also going to make it take a second variable, which is the color, because I want this to change every time I run the mutation. So my color will be a string. So I'm going to change this here. So where ID equals my ID variable. So update the pixel where the ID matches the ID that I'm passing into this mutation. So I can change a different pixel every single time if I want to. These are colons, not semicolons. I can probably zoom in a little bit here. And then I'm going to add in, after that, set. And this is going to allow me to set different things based off of my query. And so I'm going to set my color to be that color variable that I'm passing in. So my new color is going to be set to that color variable. And then I can make it return any data that I want. So returning color, X, ID, that works. You won't have X and Y. That was from an older version of this. And then you can create query variables down here. So ID, we could set it to, I think mine starts at like 1502, right? So I'm going to say 1505. It's an integer. And then my color is going to be pink. So your variables go down here in this little box. Your ID needs to be one of your IDs. So if you did things correctly and you didn't pull a me, then your ID will probably be a more reasonable number, but mine's 1504. It's okay. So now if I run this mutation, you can see that it ran successfully. Always exciting. And I'm going to copy that mutation over. I'm going to name it something better first, though. So change pixel color. So again, I'm going to go ahead and put this in a GraphQL template. Save it to a variable. Where was I even typing there? Okay. So that's my mutation right there. I'm going to use my auto formatter to make it a little bit prettier, but my mutation is called change pixel color. It takes two variables, ID and color. The ID needs to be an integer. My color is a string. I'm trying to find the pixel that matches a certain ID. When I do that, I'm going to set the color to the color variable that I'm passing in. Once I do that query successfully, it's going to return my color and my ID to me. And now I need to make it so that I am actually using this mutation. So right here, I'm going to say const update pixel color equals use mutation update color. So again, I'm passing the query as an argument to that React hook and storing the result of it to a variable, in this case, the pixel color. Okay, and now on click, so once the person clicks on the pixel, we're going to make it so that it calls that mutation. So update pixel color. Update pixel color is going to take in variables. So it needs to be in this object here. The data formatting is a little bit interesting. So object with the key variables. Then there's another object within that ID, which is ID, and color, which is new color. So new color is the color that we're changing the pixel to. So color is the one that it's currently set to. New color is the one that it's changing to. So this is my code for this file here for now. So my mutation, fingers crossed, should work when I test it out. And when I update my pixel color on my game, it should persist to the database. Fingers are crossed. So now I'm going to draw with my pixel. I'm going to fix those corners there, turn them all to black. I'll fix this line as well. And then if I refresh the page, you can see that it persisted. So even when I refresh the page now, it should work. Yep, and in the mutation, these are all colons instead of semicolons. Amazing. Any questions so far about this application? So it's complete without WebSocket. So right now it works for one user at a time, but if we want to make it work for multiple users at a time, we're going to have to go ahead and implement that now. But any questions for me before we move on to that? So you can see that right now if I have 2 localhost 3000s, I can update it on this tab, and it's not going to update on this tab. Once I refresh, it's updated on this tab, but it won't live draw. So if we want people to be able to draw at the same time, we need to go ahead and implement that. But any questions about what we've done so far? Awesome. Well, we're going to move this over to using a subscription. So we're going to use a WebSocket connection. And what WebSockets are is normally you have this request response cycle where you make a request to a route and then you get a response in return. WebSockets instead open up a channel of communication so you can send data back and forth that never really ends communication until you move off the page. And that's really cool because we can continuously update these pixels and our site will continuously update with those pixels as they're changing. It's really, really easy to change this over to that. We're gonna go ahead and go into our code again. We're gonna have to change a little bit of our connection configuration. So we need to go to that connection.js file here. And right now we're using an HTTP link. We're going to change this to a WebSocket link. So WS and then WebSocket link right there. So it's imported from a different library, but it's a WebSocket link now instead of an HTTP link. We also need to change this new HTTP link to WebSocket link. This HTTP right here needs to change to WSS. So instead of HTTP, it'll be WSS, and that's a WebSocket connection instead of a HTTP one. And then we also have options reconnect true. And this just makes it so that if the connection drops, it reconnects itself. So again, the things that I needed to change was this to WebSocket link, this to WebSocket link, this to WSS, and then I needed to add the options reconnect to true. And it makes it so that if we drop the connection, then it reconnects. So that's the first thing that we need to change. And then we need to move over to our app.js, and we're going to change our query over to a subscription. And so subscriptions follow the same syntax as queries. They just are this open channel of communication again. So subscriptions follow WebSockets. So instead of doing use query, we'll do use subscription. And we'll change where it says query right there to subscription. So we only need to change those 2 lines of code. So use subscription right there, and then change that query keyword to subscription. Now the connection should work. I need to change something though. Oh, I need this to be use subscription here as well. So need to make sure that I changed my use query that I was using down here to use subscription. And it's loading. Fingers crossed this works. Oop, 404. Refreshing again. Oh no, got more 404s. What did I do? What did I do wrong? Live debugging, always fun. So I'm gonna go back over to my connection.js and WSS, Pixar together, WebSocket link, GraphQL, options reconnect, true. What did I do? I'm gonna try restarting my server. Oh, okay. It looks like it doesn't like my trailing slash in my URL. So I'm gonna try to remove that. And it works again. Okay, thank you so much for that suggestion. That's a great catch. So delete that trailing slash. If you have a trailing slash in your URL, delete it. Not a big fan of that. Okay, and then the only last thing that we need to do is change our pixel component to update when its props update. So we're gonna use our use effect hook so that if our color being passed in to our pixel updates, we update it live as well. And so use effect, you need to import that. I'm using my auto importer, which is such a nice tool, but isn't the best for teaching because I forget to tell people to explicitly import things. So use effect needs to be imported. We're gonna add the use effect in. We're gonna only make it run when our color updates. Change color with our color. So every time that a new color prop is passed in, our color is going to update. Now, change is not defined. Where do I have change? Past my bedtime, everybody. It's late for me. Okay, magic, refreshing things, it works. Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate my tabs so that I've got 2 open and see if they both update when I update on one. So I'm gonna go ahead and change this to red, and oh my goodness, they're on both sides. So I am drawing in red right here, and it's working on this side as well. Magic. And yes, I will put my pixel code back up on my screen. So the thing that I added was I imported use effect and then changed it to have a use effect right there. And again, all of my code is also in the repo. Cool. Well, would love to answer any questions that people have about the code, but I had a lot of fun sharing this with you all tonight and hope you learned something new as well. This is probably the quickest I've ever been able to build a backend by a landslide, like no competition here, especially a fancy backend with GraphQL and WebSockets. So my mind was absolutely blown when I used Hasura for the first time, and I think that maybe some other people's will be as well. So I want to give you all a huge thank you for coming out tonight. I know a lot of you were in my class today and then also learning new things tonight. And thank you to Hasura for having me as well. I want to hand it over to them real quick to show you some other cool features.
Hey folks, I'm Sez. I'm a developer advocate at Hasura. It says I can't start video, but that's fine, I think. I'm gonna walk you through some of the features, upcoming features that we're working on. And we've made life super easy on the front end, and we thought that the next thing to do is to extend the back end. So that's what these features are about. So let me see if I can share my screen. So hopefully you can see the slides here. Oops. Present. There we go. So the first one we'll talk about is actions. The word action may be familiar, may sound familiar from Redux. The way an action works is when you create one, it becomes available as a query or mutation. When you run this query or mutation, you'll be able to run some business logic with, let's say, a serverless function. For example, before adding an email address, you might want to validate it first. So you can use the actions feature for that. The example here is a custom mutation that just runs a function to add some numbers. The next feature is custom fields. This is for extending the data model with your own custom fields. This can be backed by SQL if it's derived from existing data. It can be backed by another GraphQL server via remote joins, or it can be backed by a serverless function. In this example, the weather column is a custom field coming from a weather API. Next up is data triggers. When data changes, an event is triggered. So you have a webhook that gets called with the event. For example, you can send an email when a new user is inserted in the database. Hey, welcome, you're awesome, etc. Similarly, you can have, so this is when you insert a user in the user table, it will call a send email webhook. And then similarly, you can have scheduled triggers. Create a report every day at midnight, or send a welcome email 7 days after user creation. Hey, don't forget about us, etc. So those are the features coming up soon. If you'd like to join the Hasura community, we have a Discord channel, discord.gg/Hasura, where you can ask questions, and follow us on Twitter at HasuraHQ. That's it for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again for coming out tonight. It was great to see some new faces and some old ones as well. We're getting questions about the recordings. I don't have all the answers, but Rajoshi might. Okay, amazing. The recording and the slides will be out to you all tomorrow via email. Cool. Have a good night, everybody.